So let's talk about the guy whose name is, well, literally the definition of a certain kind of financial scam, Charles Ponzi. He built an empire from nothing but lies, promising people impossible riches and raking in millions. But the craziest part of this whole story, according to the people who knew him best, he was a total amateur.
Okay, just let that sink in for a second. That's a quote from his own publicist, and it creates this incredible puzzle, right? If Charles Ponzi was a financial idiot, how on earth did he manage to fool thousands of people and create a scam so infamous that over 100 years later, we still call it a Ponzi scheme? To really get to the bottom of the con, you first have to understand the con man. See, his story didn't start with some brilliant evil plan. It started with this deep-seated feeling that life had cheated him. Ponzi grew up absolutely convinced that he was owed a life of luxury. His family used to have money, but they lost it all, and that left him with this huge chip on his shoulder, this powerful sense of entitlement. He wanted the riches, all right? He just wasn't too keen on the hard work part. So in 1903, he sails to America to claim this fortune he feels is his birthright. But reality hit him like a ton of bricks. He just bounced from one menial job to another, and nothing ever stuck. He'd either quit because he thought the work was beneath him, or he'd get fired for, trying to cheat customers. It was a long, long way from the life of leisure he had pictured in his head. While these odd jobs weren't making him rich, a few of his other early experiences were giving him let's call it a different kind of education, one that would turn out to be way more profitable and way more destructive. Up in Montreal, Ponzi gets a job as a clerk for a little bank called Banco Zerosi. Now here's where it gets interesting. This bank was offering double the normal interest rates. How could they possibly do that? Well, they were using the money from new depositors to pay off the old ones. It's the classic robbing Peter to pay Paul setup, and Ponzi had a front row seat watching exactly how a good story could keep the cash flowing, right up until the moment it all came crashing down.
And his training wasn't just on the job. After that bank inevitably collapsed, Ponzi forged a check, got caught almost immediately, and landed himself 3 years in prison. Not long after he got out, he was arrested again, this time for smuggling immigrants. So before he ever became the world's most famous fraudster, Charles Ponzi was already a two-time convicted felon.
After years of failure and a couple stints in prison, Ponzi finally stumbled on an idea. And this idea seemed not only totally legitimate, but absolutely brilliant. This was gonna be it, the foundation of his entire empire. The idea was based on a real financial strategy called arbitrage. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple. You buy something cheap in one market, you sell it for a higher price in another, and you pocket the difference. Ponzi figured out a way to apply this to something called an international reply coupon, or an IRC. Now, his plan looked perfect on paper. Because of all the weird currency fluctuations after the war, he could buy these IRCs for next to nothing in Italy, ship them to the US, trade them in for American postage stamps, which were worth more, and then sell the stamps for a clean profit. If you could scale that up to millions of coupons, you'd be looking at a massive fortune. It was the perfect story of foolproof and totally legal business. And this is a huge but, there was a fatal flaw. In reality, the profits were so incredibly tiny that shipping and overhead costs would completely wipe them out. And even more important, to make the kind of money he was telling people about, he'd need millions and millions of these coupons. The problem? There weren't anywhere near that many IRCs in circulation in the entire world. The business was impossible from the very start.
So this is the moment. This is the pivot. A normal, legitimate business person would have just thrown in the towel, but Ponzi realized something powerful. Even if the business itself was a total dud, the story of the business was fantastic. It sounded complicated, a little bit exclusive, and it was just believable enough to work. He made a decision. He was going to sell the story, not the stamps.
Armed with a convincing but completely fake business plan, Ponzi was ready. He wasn't selling IRCs anymore. He was selling a dream, and it turned out people were desperate to buy it.
This number is the key to everything. He promised investors an absolutely unbelievable 50% return on their money in just 45 days. I mean, for people who had more hope than they had sense, for people desperate to get rich quick, this was an offer they just couldn't refuse. And the money just poured in. It was a frenzy. He'd use the cash from new investors to pay off the early ones, and those winners would spread the story of easy riches like wildfire. At its peak, his company was taking in over $250,000 a day. We're talking about crowds of people literally lining up around the block, begging this man to take their life savings.
And there it was, the life he always felt he was owed. He bought a mansion with 20 rooms, a fancy car, and started covering himself in expensive clothes and diamond pins. The guy who started out as a dishwasher was now one of the richest, most famous men in Boston. All thanks to a story.
But you know how these stories go. An empire built on lies can't last forever. As Ponzi's fame grew, so did the scrutiny, and it really didn't take a genius to figure out that something was very, very wrong.
The Boston Post, the same newspaper that had been calling him a genius, started investigating. They brought in a financial expert named Clarence Barron, who did some pretty simple math. For Ponzi's investors to actually be making money, he would have needed to be trading about 160 million IRCs. Barron found out there were only about 27,000 in circulation, worldwide. The numbers proved it. The whole thing was a complete fabrication.
The collapse happened with stunning speed. Once Barron's report hit the front page in late July, it was basically game over. The final nail in the coffin actually came from his own publicist, William McMasters, who wrote a bombshell expose based on what he knew from the inside. By the middle of August, it was all over. The scheme imploded, bankrupting banks and wiping out the life savings of tens of thousands of people.
Ponzi was arrested and indicted on 86 counts of mail fraud. But his story doesn't end there. The man who craved a life of leisure would spend the rest of his days paying for his crimes one way or another.
He served a few years in federal prison. You think he learned his lesson, right? Not a chance. He immediately fled down to Florida to start another scam, this time selling worthless swampland. He was caught again, served another 7 years, and was finally deported back to Italy. Even his loyal wife, Rose, had finally had enough and divorced him. The man who briefly had everything was left with absolutely nothing and nobody.
He drifted to Brazil, lived in poverty, and in 1949, he died alone and penniless in a charity hospital. It was a truly pathetic end for the man who once held millions in his hands, completing one of history's most dramatic rags-to-riches-to-rags stories.
And that brings us right back to that central puzzle. Charles Ponzi wasn't a financial mastermind. His real genius was in storytelling. He understood a timeless and, frankly, a dangerous human vulnerability. Our desire to believe in an easy path to wealth is often way more powerful than our willingness to actually look at the hard facts. And a century later, a good story, whether it's true or not, is still one of the most powerful forces on Earth.